This is the Classical Ideas Podcast. Welcome to the Classical Ideas Podcast. As you know, the world works in mysterious ways and gives us the good fortune of running into someone who will bring some intrigue, wisdom, and opportunity to our lives. All we need to do is be awake for such moments. Paying attention to these moments opens doors to stories. In search of caffeine one October morning, I walked through the Student Center of the University of Missouri moments before a podcast interview. A book fair was set up, and I noticed two books titled The Accidental Buddhist and The Mindful Writer. I had never heard of either of these titles. As I scanned the back covers, the woman at the checkout counter said, the author of those books is right there, and pointed about 50 feet away where a man sat at a high table near a fireplace in the ample sunshine of the bright room. I approached him. He introduced himself as Dinty W. Moore, professor of nonfiction writing at Ohio University. We discussed Zen, Thich Nhat Hanh, a little bit about community sanghas. He signed my books, I shook his hand, and promised myself to email him later that day. A promise I kept. A fortuitous moment opened a door to ask someone the stories of their life. If this podcast is about anything, it is about stories. This episode is the story of me going on the hunt for a cup of coffee and stumbling upon a writing workshop where an Ohioan professor of nonfiction writing, who happens to sometimes write books about Buddhism, sat at that exact moment. I could have walked out then and there and paid no mind to it, but I'm so glad I paid additional attention that day. The books I walked away with, The Accidental Buddhist, published in 1997, and The Mindful Writer, published in 2016, were both at times beautiful, inspirational, hilarious, awkward, and descriptive of Americans seeking to find something within the 2,500-year-old tradition of Buddhism and struggling to just sit down and shut up. Personally, I've done some fairly regular secular meditation practice in an effort to come to terms with my own personal baggage. I liken my meditation practice to getting repeatedly punched in the face in complete stillness and not ducking when the second, third, fourth, fifth punches land. Meditation is no easy act. Failure is imminent, and then failure passes, and then failure occurs again, and then failure passes. Dinty's failure on the page in his books when describing his meditation practice is me as well. His failures in meditation are likely yours too if you know the practice and have tried it. I learned a lot in this conversation from Dinty, a 30-year practitioner of various Buddhist practices, but who still struggles to enact the practices in his day-to-day life. He tells the every person story of Buddhism in America with great candor, humor, and humility. In that regard, his book stands out to me for even someone with no interest in practicing Buddhism themselves, but who has a curiosity to know a tad more about a major religion in the world followed by some 500 million people worldwide. I had a blast preparing for this conversation with Dinty's excellent books. I heartily recommend both. If you have a passing interest in Buddhism, check out The Accidental Buddhist. If you have an interest in writing, check out The Mindful Writer. So my guest today is Dinty W. Moore. Dinty W. Moore is author of 7 books and many essays and stories. He is a professor of nonfiction writing at Ohio University, the editor of Brevity Magazine, and he lives in Athens, Ohio, where he grows heirloom tomatoes and edible dandelions. Pay attention, people, to fortuitously opened doors. The stories are waiting to be told. Without further delay, I bring you Dinty W. Moore. Welcome to the Classical Ideas Podcast. I'm here today with Dinty Moore, author of The Accidental Buddhist and The Mindful Writer, among others. Dinty, thank you for coming on the Classical Ideas Podcast.
Thank you.
So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the day that we met. Do you remember anything about that?
Let's see. I was in Columbia, Missouri. The Show Me Writers Conference was happening at the university there. Um, I don't know that you were at the conference. I think you were just wandering through the student union and saw the bookstore they'd set up and noticed two of my books that had to do with Buddhist themes. And next thing you knew, you tracked me down at a table and we were talking.
Yeah, it was really funny. I was reading the titles of the books, and I immediately latched onto them, and I was going to buy them anyway. And then a young woman at the checkout counter said, "Well, that's him right there," and I just basically marched on over to you. And what's really funny is I was on my way to another podcast interview with Dennis Kelly to talk about American indigenous religions, and I told you all that, and you're like, "Oh, that sounds good." So I left the student union that day, like completely encouraged to reach out to you again. So I'm really grateful to you for accepting my invitation to come back on and talk to me.
Happy to do it.
So if you could go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit, maybe talk about your job, maybe talk about what you're known for within the spiritual world, that'd be great.
Well, I'm a writer. I've written a lot of books. Two and a half of them relate directly to my Buddhist practice and my thinking about Buddhism. I write a lot about Catholicism too, but most of that is my negative feelings having gone through 12 years of Catholic school. I also teach writing at Ohio University and at various writers' conferences like the Show Me Writers Conference where I met you. How am I known in the spiritual world? I don't know that I am. I mean, I've written these books, so people read them, but I'm not a teacher. I'm not a spiritual teacher. I'm not a monk. I'm not a particularly good person to come to if you want to, pursue Buddhism, because I'm just a student of Buddhism myself.
Awesome. I love that, that you are just an ordinary practitioner also, you've done a lot of different things, which we'll talk about from Accidental Buddhist, among others. So one of the things that I've been doing since you and I met at that writers' conference in Columbia, Missouri, is that I have read The Mindful Writer and The Accidental Buddhist all the way through, and I really enjoyed them. And so you talk, a few of my previous episodes, I talked about Zen, and we discussed koans, and your book, The Mindful Writer, starts off with a dedication to, quote, those struggling with the arduous but magnificent koan of the written word. So I'm curious if you can talk about why writing as koan inspires you.
My view of writing, and I'm not the only writer who would say this to you, is that, if you're writing literary works, and literary is kind of a highfalutin word, but the difference between instruction manuals and the work that adults read to try to understand their lives. If you're writing the works, the type of work, whether it's poetry, prose, fiction, or nonfiction, that the serious readers read because they're trying to understand life and their lives, and they like getting lost in a good story. What drives that kind of writing is the unanswerable questions. The things that we lay awake at night wondering about, whether it's religion, how did we get here, or whether it's just our lives, our love lives, our families, why good people try really hard to connect and somehow marriages fail, or children go astray, or friends end up not being friends. It's all those things that that there is no easy answer to, but you can spend your whole life thinking about. That's what writing is about, and that's, to me, the koan of the written word.
Yeah, it's like that magnificent path down the third way, the unexpected way, the irrational, or the thing that doesn't immediately appear simple with logic, right?
Yeah, human beings are living contradictions. Everybody I know doesn't really make sense, except once you accept the fact that we're not black and white, easy to classify. Well, I'll just leave it at that. It's that human beings are contradictions, and life ends up being a confusing contradiction of its own, and we just try our best.
Yeah, the pain and suffering of just being alive on a day-to-day basis is so universal and so real. And the second I read that introduction to the book, I was like, "Oh, great! He's written this book for me. It's so fantastic that now I have this little tool to help me out." So I appreciated that because it felt really personal. So,
Great.
yeah. So you write extensively about the difficulty of sitting in the Accidental Buddhist, which, trust me, I understand. Whenever I was watching you on the page in the Accidental Buddhist struggle in your sitting, I felt it. And then in Mindful Rider, you then say that you discover significant moments in your everyday life by sitting, by listening, with which I also agree. I realized I was really fidgety right before this interview, so I'm sitting in my chair in my office right now, and I just kind of closed my eyes and told myself, breathing in, I know that I am breathing in, and within 5 minutes I was completely calm. But what have you discovered recently about the everyday in your own sitting practice?
Um, I've discovered that as much as I wish I could sit for half an hour every day, 20 seconds sometimes.
Yeah.
Like before I go in to talk to someone in their office, or before another student comes in to talk to me in my office. 20 seconds can make a difference. I'm not trying to set everybody's goals that low. Certainly there's much more to be learned from a more disciplined practice, but just the settling of the mind that could happen in 10 or 20 seconds, as opposed to the human tendency to just race from one thing to another, that I think has gotten worse, as our life gets more automated. So yeah, I mean the importance of centering the mind, whether you call that meditation or not, because it only takes 20 seconds, is powerful. It's another use of what happens in a longer sitting.
How long have you been practicing now?
I've been practicing badly since, I think it's been 30 years, 25 to 30 years.
At the end of Accidental Buddhist, I love that you just said badly, because I think that a lot of people could resonate with that. And at the end of the Accidental Buddhist, you say, "What kind of Buddhist am I? A lousy one." Are you still a lousy Buddhist?
Yeah, I mean, I say that with my tongue in my cheek.
Absolutely.
I'm not real. I'm not. I have a job. I have a very busy job, and I have my writing, career, and that on top of it. I spend too much time on the internet many days. I haven't come even close to the person I thought, I wanted to become when I first discovered the power of Buddhist thought. A lot of what's important to me about Buddhism is sort of the philosophy behind it, and the power of sitting, and the power of compassion. Like many people, I started to discover those and said in my mind, this is going to change my life. Well, it did, but in ways far less dramatic than I imagined. I'm not an entirely chill individual who's aware and centered, 24 hours a day. I'm just still a mess, but I've found a way to catch myself that I didn't have before.
You mentioned a lot, all those things just now. So you've been practicing for 25 or 30 years, and you still see the difficulty in it every single day. How do you feel about the mindfulness craze that's taken over America in the last 20 years?
It doesn't. Well, my book is entitled "The Mindful Writer," so I better not be bothered by it. I keep reading reading articles or Facebook posts or notes to various magazines from people who are kind of upset by how the mindfulness movement has become secularized or oversimplified, or it's gone from a spiritual practice to, in some cases, a commodity. I read those things, and I'm sympathetic to what people are saying, but it's not bad. It's like mindfulness, even if you do it outside of a Buddhist framework, even if you do it somewhat simplistically, it's still a good thing. So I'm happy to see mindfulness, whether it's secular mindfulness or even for that matter, commercial mindfulness, the books and tapes and other things that are, circulating rather widely in our culture now. I'm actually glad to see those because I think, it's just good for people to be aware that they're not aware, to be aware that there is something other than mindlessness or mindless racing from thing to thing. So I like mindfulness in the deepest spiritual realm, and I also think it's okay that people are doing it, in other more secular ways, because if people's minds and lives are healthier around me, then that's good for me too, and good for everybody else.
So speaking of aware versus unaware, you said that you ignored the world for 30 years until you began to sit. So why is it so hard if we know the benefits of sitting, yet we continue to fail to sit? Why do you think this is so?
I don't know. I suppose it's built into the human animal somehow. I learned in another book that I wrote about why we're superstitious as people, and it's and this is a really simple explanation, but it's a very simple explanation, but just ride with me a minute.
Sure.
When we were our earliest humans, or whatever it is, this is true of apes too, but let's just pretend it's the moment that we stopped being apes and became humans, which I don't even know if that makes sense to me. But as we evolved as creatures, we reached a point, or maybe we always had this point. I'm going to start this story over.
That's fine.
We're creatures, and for a while there, we were creatures living, out there in the wild, surrounded by wild beasts. I'm talking tens of thousands of years ago, what cartoons like to call cavemen, but that's a silly picture too. So what I learned is, if you look behind a tree or in a bush and you see something that may or may not be a tiger, if you panic and run, the chances of you living to see another day are better than if you just stand around and wait to see if it really is a tiger. So the alternative is, that could be a tiger, but maybe it's just a funny way that the light is hitting the leaves. Let me walk up a little closer to that bush and see what it really is. Well, if it actually turns out to actually be an animal that wants to attack and kill you, a hungry tiger, your willingness to stand around and sort of puzzle out, what is that in the bush? Is it a tiger or just the way the sun is hitting the leaves? It's going to kill you. So that makes us so there's a evolutionary advantage to being nervous and paranoid and anxious, unfortunately. So I think we're probably hardwired to be nervous and paranoid and anxious in certain ways, because of evolution and because it is a survival mechanism. I don't know that it's a survival mechanism that serves us very well in the modern world. I know that in many cases it's not. So perhaps the reason we have such trouble being our best Buddhist selves, our best meditative selves, our most mindful and clear-headed selves is that we're fighting some sort of chemical process that is natural to our brain.
And when we drive,
does that make any sense?
Absolutely.
That make any sense?
Yeah,
Oh,
and like when we drive down the highway, that survival instinct, it comes out the worst in us. Or, you know what I mean? Or when things are going wrong at work, or when you have like 15 tasks ahead of you at work, that survival instinct seems to come out the worst in us. I know it does in me. I'm a teacher too, so I understand the difficulty of what you said earlier about your busy job. Like, I feel like I'm in a hurry 100% of the time.
Yeah, and I want to do my job well.
Exactly.
So it's like, if I tell my students, life is short.
Yeah.
There is no me. Everything's, everything's just an amorphous universe. So I'm not going to teach tomorrow. Yeah, that just doesn't. That sounds good, but it's not. I'm not that person either.
Absolutely. Um, so in your book, The Mindful Writer, which I really like, you talked about how writing matters, and you encouraged your students to figure out moments when when they say to themselves, "What I'm doing matters." So when you sit, do you realize ways that your own writing, teaching, personal life matter? So like, what is a moment you've recently had where you tell yourself, "This really matters right now"?
Um, I will go back to the teaching part of it. That there's going through the motions of meeting with your students to discuss the latest assignment, whatever that is, and then there's sort of being present. And I just went through a series of meetings with all of my students this current semester, and I left lots of time. I mean, some of the meetings only lasted 10 minutes, but I left 45 minutes, for each one. And sometimes the students, and I talked over the next assignment, and then I asked them what they're doing for the holidays, and then and I got to know them as human beings in ways that certainly wasn't happening in the classroom. And that there's some mindfulness there, that led me to that idea that I wanted to spend more time with my students and talk to them about things other than what we're learning in the classroom.
And I think that they walk away with a totally different picture of you then as well, most likely, wouldn't you say?
I'm sorry, pardon me?
Wouldn't you think that they...
Talking about mindfulness, I spaced out a moment there.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Do you think that they walk away with a different picture of you then as well in that moment?
I hope so. I don't know. I mean, me as in it's all about me, but it certainly, I think, this would be true about any profession. It's not unique to teaching. It's good for people to realize there's a human being on the other side of the classroom. Sometimes I think students don't realize their teachers are human beings. They're just assignment givers. I think it's good when we realize there's a human being behind the police officer's uniform. It's good when we realize there's a human being who's ringing up our groceries at the grocery store, not just somebody who slides things, along, and the barcode reader. I think all those human interactions where we actually connect as human beings, that's karma to me. That adds good karma to the world.
That just reminded me of an article that I read in Tricycle with actually a previous guest on this podcast, Sato Ray Ronci. He's a professor in the English department at the University of Missouri. He's a poet, and he's also a Rinzai Zen monk. And he wrote a piece called The Examined Life that I think that you would really love, about his dual role as a monk and as a professor, and how those two identities can come out in his behavior in the classroom as a teacher. And it was an absolutely beautiful piece of writing, and it really just speaks to, how people see us. So some people see us as a father, some people see us as a teacher, some people see us as a student, some people see us as a son, and how all those roles can look different based on who's looking at us in that moment.
Yeah, and I can remember trying to be a little more present for my, wife and daughter 25 years ago when all this sitting stuff began, and I realized, that sometimes I just go through the motions. This is what a father says. This is what a father does. This is how a father acts. This is how. And my daughter was very, very, very young at that time. This is how a father makes his kid laugh. This is how a father gets food. And I was, it's like we have these ideas in our head about how things are supposed to happen, and we don't even stop and think sometimes. So nowadays I do a lot of time, thinking, am I really being an effective teacher?
Mm-hmm.
Or am I doing what I think I'm supposed to do, and I'm wasting everybody's time? And I can remember having to sort of think through some of that about being a dad. I still do, but my daughter's very much grown up and living out of the house and living in another city. So it's not the sort of the day-to-day interaction, but but any human interaction. that we have. There's going through the motions of either just by not paying attention, or this is the way you're supposed to talk to the person, at the grocery store, versus, well, maybe you don't have to have that screen and that distance. Maybe you can actually notice them and say something that makes them notice you.
So I want you to go down a hypothetical scenario with me here for a second. Imagine that I am you 25 years ago.
Uh-huh.
I have a 4-year-old daughter right now. So imagine that you are talking to yourself when your daughter was 4 at this point in your life, and you're talking to the you of when your daughter was 4. What would you say to yourself in that moment?
You have to work much harder to listen to what's really behind the words and what's not being said, especially as she gets older and it's more difficult for her to say things to you. I'm a person who doesn't like to hear the bad news. So, if my daughter was happy, I would hear that. And if my daughter was perhaps, and not necessarily at 4, but your daughter's going to get older and it gets more complicated. As my daughter got older and it got more complicated, I remained happy to hear the good news, but I didn't always listen hard enough to see what she was struggling with. And I could have done a much better job.
Thank you. I'll remember that. So your professional and spiritual life, to me, I've only read 2 of your many books, but it seems to me that your professional and your spiritual life are like almost completely intertwined. Can you envision one without the other?
I think you're giving me too much credit, but I appreciate the thought. We're talking today about ways that I bring mindfulness or compassion to my teaching. And because we're talking about it, I'm giving you examples, but I'm sure there are days, weeks, God forbid months, that I stumble along and don't do a very good job. But anyway, so they're fully intertwined. Maybe not. Maybe I'm still, like I always said, I'm just trying to do better. I'm trying to intertwine them a little bit better next year than I did this past year. So now that I've got my long caveat out of the way, I can imagine. Sometimes I imagine my spiritual life without my busy. I'm a writer. I'm a teacher. I travel. I'm a public speaker. I edit a magazine. Sometimes I imagine my spiritual life if I weren't so busy with all of these things. And what I imagine is perhaps a fantasy daydream where I'm have time to just walk along and appreciate the air and the sun and the sound of the birds more than I do. I do that sometimes, but how it is, you don't do it nearly as much as you should. I imagine I spend more time out in nature. So I can easily imagine my spiritual life without my professional life. Although I don't know if what I'm imagining is just real or fantasy. My professional life without my spiritual life, I think it would be much less. I don't think I'd be as good at it as in all my human interactions as an editor, as a teacher, as a visiting writer. I don't think I'd be nearly as effective if I didn't have the things that I've learned from my Buddhist practice, to bring to the table. I don't think it would be as fulfilling for me if I didn't have those things. I think it would be. I never want to become that person who hates their job. And I don't hate my job. I love my job. And I certainly don't want to be that person who has a really good job. I have a really good job. Who has great comforts and safety in the world. I have great comfort and safety in the world. I have health insurance. I have a regular salary, all that. I never want to be the person who has all of that going and hates and complains about it all the time. And I know people, way too many people that I work with, maybe you do too, who, they have a job, they have a steady paycheck, they have health insurance, they have a house, they have relative health, and all they do is complain about, what a crappy life they're living. I'm rambling a bit here, but I think what I'm trying to say is I think my spiritual life allows me to catch myself and realize, I
Yeah,
have bad days. My knees hurt.
absolutely.
There's the few people I work with are unpleasant, but man, I'm lucky. I'm lucky.
And that's mindfulness as well,
Yeah.
So let's talk about failure for a second. Which,
Okay.
in the writing, I've dabbled in a little bit of creative writing here and there, and every moment that I am trying to put words on paper, it's almost as if I am just telling myself nonstop how terrible this is. This is so bad, so bad, so bad. No one would ever want to look at this. So if people feel like they're failing, you say in The Mindful Writer that sitting with the forces of failure is important. You likely see many students in your job who are struggling with such moments. So when you see people who are battling with these forces of failure, what do you say to them?
Well, I'm speaking now as a writing teacher, which I am. I started out by saying I'm not a spiritual teacher or a monk or a religious authority. I am a writing teacher, and I've spent many years doing that, and I know a fair bit about it. Those voices in your head that are telling you this is a lousy first draft, these are trite thoughts. These are really flat, uninteresting sentences. Everybody has those voices. I've published many books. I have those voices. It's just kind of normal. You have to learn to sort of shut them off. What I like to say is, I talk back to them. I'm at the beginning of a writing project, writing an early draft of something, and these voices come in saying, this is just a waste of time. This is stupid. It's not going anywhere. These sentences are flat. And I just go, yeah, I know, but I'm going to keep going anyway. You just have to shrug and take the power away from those voices. Bad first drafts are where kind of crappy second drafts come from, and that leads to a third draft where you start to get a kind of an idea what it is you want to do, and then 4, 5, 6 drafts later you've got an idea that makes sense. You're writing about it. You're suddenly caring about it, and you're fixing the sentences that seemed rather flat and boring and making them a little more vivid. That's just a normal part of the process. Maybe there's a genius out there somewhere who sits down, in front of the typewriter or computer keyboard and writes a beautiful first draft right off the bat, but I haven't met that person.
Yeah, that would probably be like Alexander Hamilton or something like that.
Yeah. It's this whole sort of struggling and self-doubt is, the self-doubt is part of the process. We all have that, but frankly, writing the first draft of anything, a poem, a story, an essay, a business document in many cases, unless you're just going through the motions, that's the process of figuring out what you want to say. You figure out what you want to say by writing it down, and then you write down 15 sentences and okay, 2 of those belong. The rest of them were just me spinning my wheels trying to figure out what I wanted to say. So, to you and every other writer who has that voice, as they sit down to write, the three bits of information, that's kind of how it works. You're going to have that voice, and just talk back to that voice and say, yeah, you're right, but I'm going to keep going anyway. And
then when you hit that third or fourth draft, you tie back to that thing we talked about earlier, which is when you can tell yourself what I am doing matters.
Yeah.
Awesome. So 10 years ago, I took a job in Mexico, the country, and I went and taught down there, and then I went and taught in the UK for a little while. So these experiences now, we're very early in my teaching career, and I've done so many things since then, but I am still learning so much from those events, 8-10 years later. So, I often find that I learn the biggest lessons when something is 5 or 10 years in my past. In the moment, I'm just going through those experiences, just blindly, just kind of flailing around. But then years later, I find that I'm still learning from those experiences way later. So this year's the 20th anniversary of the Accidental Buddhist, which is very fortuitous for our conversation. And this book portrays an American in search of something that just about any of us can identify with. So what are your best memories of that journey into American Buddhism 20 years ago, and what stands out as the most meaningful lessons that are still impacting you?
Let's see. Good question. I mean, I still remember the people, and maybe that's, I started the Accidental Buddhist. I don't know if it's clear from the book. I started the Accidental Buddhist sort of thinking I was going to be a reporter. I was going to walk around with a notebook and take notes about these people that didn't make much sense to me. The short version of it is, Buddhism is 2,500 years old. It's so, at least back then, well, it still is in many cases, so wrapped up in Asian culture, even in American zendos and American retreat centers and American monasteries. Like you walk in, it's like everything's Asian, or a lot of it seems Asian. So it's Asian, it's very, very ancient, and it seemed antithetical to the slowing down part of Buddhism, seemed antithetical to our life. 20 years ago, the internet was just sort of bubbling up to the surface. Everybody had, beepers, not cell phones yet, but beepers. America was all about do it faster, do it faster, do it better. And I'm thinking well, so Buddhism doesn't make any sense in America. We're not Asians. It's such an old thing, and we're all about going faster. Why are people so attracted to Buddhism? And I thought I was going to go around with a notebook and sort of try to puzzle that out by interviewing people and then writing stories about what they told me. I didn't think I was going to so quickly and deeply and enthusiastically embrace what I found at these zendos and retreat centers. But the people I met just were so warm. The compassion side of Buddhism were just so warm and so open that I think that's a large reason why I kind of hung around and said, well, instead of just interviewing people, maybe I'll sit with them for 3 hours, or maybe I'll sit with them for 3 days, or maybe I'll do a 7-day sesshin. Maybe I'll try this, try this out. I think the people that I connected with early on were the reason. I saw something in them, and I sort of a sense of peace and a sense of compassion in them that I wanted to know more about. And that's my memory. I could name individual people, but it was just about everywhere I went, whether it was, the monastery hidden in the hills of West Virginia, or the little one-room, sitting retreat center in Iowa City. I just walked into the room and it's like, these are nice people.
Yeah, my favorite story in that book involves the Father Robert Jensen Kennedy.
Yes.
And that really stood out to me, that he could be a Zen teacher and
a Jesuit priest.
Right. Yeah. Did that really blow your mind?
It did, especially because I was coming from, I still have, but I have a lot of resentment towards what Catholicism taught me. The negativity of the Catholic, the sense of original sin, that we're all very bad. That kind of hit me hard when I was a kid because of problems I was having at home. Catholic school back in the 60s was a rough place with a lot of angry nuns who had free reign to hit you, and I got spanked a lot, paddled a lot. So I've lived my life with a lot of resentment about, God, that was a lousy religious upbringing. The opposite of what, people should be doing is what the Catholic Church, at least my Catholic Church in my little town in Pennsylvania, it was the opposite of what they should have been doing, and it actually scarred me in certain ways. Okay, so that's my background. And then to meet this man who's doing both, and it was a very emotional experience to talk to him, not just about Buddhism, but about my feelings about the Catholic Church. That was very powerful, and I'm very thankful to him all these years later.
Yeah, and he's that was such a cool story. And his book, I don't know if you had a chance to look at it. It might have been a long time, but Zen Spirit, Christian Spirit. I'm actually reading that right now, and it's so wonderful to see how our cultures can speak to each other, the East and the West, and how we can live in multiple worlds and what wisdom we can glean from different traditions while still staying true to our original motivations in life.
Right. And many, many intelligent spiritual people, both on the Christian side and the Buddhist side, have pointed out that the words of Jesus and the words of the Buddha are entirely compatible. It's organized religion that I have my argument with, not the words of Jesus.
So, what are some of your future spiritual goals? What do you have on your bucket list?
Yeah, just keep. I backslide. I get very serious about my Buddhism. I meditate, regularly. I think, I remind myself regularly to remember these lessons I've learned, and then I start backsliding and forgetting, and life gets busy, and my mind gets sloppy, and I'm always like, gotta get back to it. I guess that's going to be a lifelong practice. I'm sure I'm probably be on my deathbed thinking, I should have been a better Buddhist. So that's a simple. That's not a very dramatic goal. I'm in my early 60s. I suppose someday I'll be lucky enough to retire, and maybe I can do more. Longer retreats and sessions and things. I'd like to get back to that. It's been a long time since I've done something like that.
Awesome. So I'm curious about what inspires or who inspires you the most. So like maybe if you could recommend a few books for people to check out, writers that have inspired you, teachers that have inspired you, anything.
Yeah, all of the books by Thich Nhat Hanh are wonderful. Certainly his early books like Pieces Every Step was an entry level for me. There's also tapes. You can buy tapes of him giving talks and lectures, and just his voice. Even sometimes, he has a strong accent still. Thich Nhat Hanh is a Vietnamese monk, and sometimes just listening to his tapes, there's a joy in his voice, even if I couldn't quite make out what he was saying at the moment, was somehow powerful. But Thich Nhat Hanh, Bhante Gunaratana, Mindfulness in Plain English, is a wonderful book. There's a book by Bhante Henepola Gunaratana, but it's easier just to Google the title, Mindfulness in Plain English. I mention him in the book, but in my book, because he's one of the people I studied with, but his book, Mindfulness in Plain English, still remains, I think, one of the best introductions to Buddhism and mindfulness that I've read.
We're coming to the end of our time here today, and I'm really grateful to you to spending your hour this morning with me. So where can people find you online if they want to know more about your work? www.dintywmore.com. So, Dinty Moore is a name some people might remember from the grocery store, but I go by Dinty W Moore, and that's the website as well. If you put the W in there. Excellent. Dinty, it's been fantastic connecting with you again after our very random meeting in Columbia, Missouri, those months ago. And
yes, I'm so glad we ran into each other.
That was just so strange, and I love the way that the world works sometimes, putting people together, and I'm excited for people to check out your work, and I'm very grateful to you for spending this time with me today.
I'm grateful to you for spending the time with me, too, and asking me such nice questions.
Fantastic. Thanks.
The Classical Ideas podcast is written and performed by me, Greg Soden. Original music is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. His music can be found at www.wearewarmmusic.com. Thanks for listening.